Hey guys, tonight we begin with something truly insane. Medieval pilgrimage, where faith meets blisters, and blisters usually win. We're talking about a time when people walked 1,000 miles through plague-ridden Europe, with no GPS, no decent shoes, and religious enthusiasm that bordered on clinical delusion. Drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from, and what time it is right now. I always love seeing this little time-traveling community gathering here from all over the world. Now, dim the lights, tuck yourself in, and let's drift far, far away. The year is 3047, and you've just made the worst decision of your medieval life. You're standing outside Canterbury Cathedral, clutching a cloth sack, wearing what can generously be called shoes, and you've decided to walk to Spain. Not ride, not sail. Walk through countries where they don't speak your language, eat your food, or particularly care if you live or die. Your navigation system, following other people who look slightly less lost than you, asking directions from locals who speak in dialects that sound like angry geese, and occasionally spotting scallop shell markers, assuming bandits haven't stolen them for soup bowls. Welcome to medieval GPS, where getting lost isn't just possible, it's practically guaranteed. Your shoes are already a disaster, and you've only been walking for 3 days. Those leather strips masquerading as footwear, they were clearly made by someone who'd never walked further than the local tavern. The soles have separated from the uppers, leaving you essentially barefoot, except for some decorative leather flaps that mock your poor life choices. Each step feels like dancing on broken pottery, while someone throws rocks at your ankles in a thunderstorm. But you're not alone in your suffering. The muddy path ahead is littered with fellow pilgrims, limping forward like a medieval zombie parade, some clutching walking sticks, others clutching what's left of their dignity, and a few who've given up entirely, selling their belongings to anyone gullible enough to buy a blessed wooden spoon. So how exactly do you navigate 1,000 miles without Google Maps, without street signs, without anyone who actually knows where Santiago is? Welcome to medieval wayfinding, where asking for directions is like playing charades, with people who think you might be a bandit, a spy, or just mentally unstable. Your compass is the sun, assuming it's not hidden behind clouds, which it usually is. Your map is whatever someone scratched into the dirt before the rain washed it away, and your backup plan, following the person in front of you and hoping they're not just wandering aimlessly through the French countryside, looking for a decent place to die. The roads, if you can call them roads, are basically mud rivers with delusions of grandeur. In good weather, they're rutted dirt tracks that twist your ankles and test your commitment to staying upright. In bad weather, they're knee-deep swamps that swallow pilgrims whole, never to be seen again, except for the occasional hat floating downstream. Roman roads exist, in theory, but they're either crumbling into archaeological curiosities or have been repurposed as bandit headquarters. You're walking on paths that were probably carved by confused cows, following routes that meander through every possible obstacle, including mountains that seem personally offended by your existence. Your fellow travelers are a fascinating collection of the faithful, the desperate, and the clinically insane. There's Brother Francis, who's been walking in circles for 3 weeks, because he insists the Lord will guide his feet, even though the Lord apparently has a terrible sense of direction. Then there's Marguerite from Normandy, carrying enough fake relics to stock a cathedral gift shop, most of which she bought from merchants who claimed they were blessed by saints, who probably never existed. And don't forget Guillaume the merchant, who joined this pilgrimage not for spiritual reasons, but because he owes money to half of Paris, and figured walking to Spain was cheaper than hiring bodyguards. The accommodations along the way range from barely adequate to criminally dangerous. Monastery guest houses offer beds, and by beds we mean straw mattresses, shared with 3 strangers, and whatever insects decided to call them home. You'll sleep shoulder to shoulder with a snoring blacksmith, a weeping widow, and someone who keeps mumbling Latin prayers in their sleep, or possibly casting spells. It's hard to tell in the dark. Private inns exist for those with coin, but they're essentially legalized robbery operations, where you pay premium prices for rooms that smell like dead fish, walls thin enough to hear your neighbor's digestive issues, and bed sheets that haven't been washed since the Crusades ended. When proper lodging isn't available, which is most of the time, you're camping under the stars, assuming the stars are visible through the perpetual cloud cover that follows pilgrims like a medieval curse. Your tent is a piece of oiled cloth that leaks in 17 different places, providing you with a gentle indoor rainstorm throughout the night. The ground beneath you is either rocks that feel like torture devices, mud that squelches unpleasantly every time you move, or suspicious patches of earth that smell like something died there, which something probably did. Food on the road is an adventure in creative desperation. Monastery kitchens serve pottage, a mysterious stew that's been simmering since the last group of pilgrims passed through, with new ingredients added daily, and old ingredients never removed. It's less a meal than an archaeological dig through layers of culinary history. When you can't reach a monastery, you're foraging like a particularly optimistic squirrel, eating berries that might be edible, nuts that might not be poisonous, and roots that taste like disappointment, mixed with soil. Local markets offer bread that could double as building materials, cheese that's developed its own ecosystem, and meat of such questionable origin that even the flies seem hesitant to land on it. Water is perhaps the greatest challenge of all. Rivers and streams look clean and inviting, until you notice the dead sheep floating upstream, or the village that's been using the water source as their communal toilet for generations. Wells are safer in theory, but you never know if someone's been dropping unspeakable things down them, for good luck, or bad intentions. Most pilgrims stick to ale and wine, which means you're spending your spiritual journey in a state of mild intoxication, stumbling towards salvation, one tipsy step at a time. At least being slightly drunk makes the pain in your feet more bearable, and the singing of your fellow pilgrims marginally less offensive. The weather seems personally offended by your decision to walk across Europe. Rain falls with the consistency of divine punishment, soaking through your woolen cloak and making you smell like a wet sheep with boundary issues. The sun emerges just long enough to create false hope before disappearing behind clouds that look suspiciously like they're plotting against you. Wind cuts through your clothes like it has a personal vendetta, and snow arrives without warning, turning your already treacherous path into a slip and slide of potential death. You learn to read the sky like a holy text, searching for signs of merciful weather, but mostly finding evidence that God has a twisted sense of humor. Speaking of twisted senses of humor, let's talk about the bandits. Highway robbery isn't just a profession in medieval Europe, it's practically a cottage industry. These enterprising criminals have turned pilgrim robbing into an art form, complete with fake monks who offer spiritual guidance before stealing your purse, hollow trees that disgorge armed men like angry squirrels, and toll roads that appear overnight, with surprisingly official-looking guards who demand payment for passage through forests that belong to no one in particular. The clever bandits have learned that pilgrims carry surprisingly little worth stealing, so they've diversified into kidnapping for ransom, selling protection services, and offering guided tours that lead directly into ambushes. Your fellow pilgrims have developed various strategies for dealing with these occupational hazards. Some travel in large groups, figuring there's safety in numbers, which works until the large group attracts large bands of robbers who see it as an efficiency improvement. Others try to look as poor and pathetic as possible, which isn't difficult after weeks on the road, reasoning that even bandits have standards. The truly paranoid bury their valuables, mark the spots with secret signs, and spend the rest of the journey trying to remember where they buried their life savings, often unsuccessfully. Many arrive at Santiago spiritually enriched, but financially ruined, having donated their worldly possessions to the bandit community along the way. The religious aspects of pilgrimage are complicated. You're supposed to be walking towards spiritual enlightenment, but mostly you're walking toward the next place where you can sit down and examine your blisters. Prayer becomes a constant background activity, partly from devotion, partly from the desperate hope that divine intervention might improve your circumstances, and partly because quiet mumbling helps distract from the pain in your feet. You collect religious souvenirs along the way, blessed pebbles from holy sites, vials of sacred water that may or may not be sacred, and relics of dubious authenticity sold by enterprising locals who've discovered that pilgrims will pay good money for anything with a certificate of holiness. The scallop shell becomes your most prized possession, marking you as a legitimate pilgrim rather than a vagrant wandering aimlessly through the countryside. These shells serve as passport, currency, and social status symbol, all rolled into one. Fake shells are a thriving black market commodity, with shell forgers operating sophisticated counterfeiting operations, complete with aging techniques and false authentication documents. Losing your shell is catastrophic, relegating you to the status of suspicious wanderer who might be a bandit, spy, or worse, a tourist. The shell economy becomes so complex that exchange rates develop, with pristine shells commanding premium prices and damaged ones trading at discount rates. Medical care on the road consists primarily of folk remedies, fervent prayer, and hoping whatever's wrong with you goes away before it kills you. Monastery infirmaries offer treatments that range from surprisingly effective herbal remedies to bloodletting sessions that leave you weaker than when you arrived. Traveling physicians are usually charlatans with impressive-sounding credentials, selling miracle cures that contain ingredients you'd rather not identify. When someone falls seriously ill, the group faces a terrible choice: abandon them to die alone, carry them and slow everyone down, or find a monastery willing to take responsibility for their spiritual and physical care, assuming such a place exists and has room for another dying pilgrim. The social dynamics of pilgrimage groups are fascinating studies. In medieval psychology under extreme duress, leadership typically falls to whoever has the loudest voice, the most convincing religious credentials, or the sharpest knife. Democratic decision-making exists until someone suggests a route that adds extra days to the journey, at which point democracy dissolves into arguments, threats, and occasional physical violence between people who are supposedly walking towards spiritual enlightenment. Personality conflicts that would be minor irritations in normal life become epic feuds when you're trapped together for months, walking endless miles through hostile territory, while suffering from perpetual discomfort and questionable nutrition. Romance blooms on the pilgrim road, because apparently nothing says true love like shared suffering and communal lice infestations. Young pilgrims find each other attractive, despite, or perhaps because of, their mutually disheveled appearances and ody unwashed traveler fragrance. These relationships face unique challenges, like maintaining privacy when you're sleeping in group accommodations, conducting courtship conversations while walking in single file through mountain passes, and dealing with disapproving fellow pilgrims who believe romance is incompatible with spiritual seeking. Marriage proposals happen at shrines, blessed by priests who may or may not have authority to perform ceremonies, creating unions of questionable legal validity but undeniable romantic commitment. Language barriers create constant communication breakdowns that would be amusing if they weren't potentially fatal. Pilgrims from different regions speak dialects so divergent they might as well be different languages entirely. Asking for directions becomes an elaborate charades performance, with gestures that could mean turn left at the oak tree, or bandits ahead, or I need to use the privy immediately. Misunderstandings lead to groups walking in completely wrong directions for days, following paths toward destinations they never intended to visit, while the locals watch in bewildered amusement as foreign pilgrims march confidently toward dead ends, cliff faces, or territories controlled by particularly unfriendly nobles. The economy of pilgrimage creates its own micro-markets along the routes. Enterprising locals set up seasonal businesses, catering specifically to pilgrim needs, selling overpriced blessed bread, watered-down wine at premium prices, and repair services for damaged equipment at rates that would make modern airport shops blush. Some villages become entirely dependent on pilgrim traffic, with entire families specializing in different aspects of traveler exploitation, from the grandmother who sells dubious healing potions to the uncle who offers shoe repair using leather scraps and hope. During peak pilgrimage seasons, these communities experience economic booms, while off-season months leave them struggling to survive on whatever legitimate cheddades they can maintain. Seasonal variations dramatically affect the pilgrimage experience. Spring departures face muddy roads and swollen rivers, but benefit from mild weather and abundant food supplies. Summer pilgrims enjoy longer daylight hours and better traveling conditions, but suffer from heat, drought, and increased bandit activity as more targets become available. Autumn travelers encounter beautiful scenery and harvest festivals, but risk being caught by early winter weather in mountain passes. Winter pilgrims are generally considered either remarkably dedicated or clinically insane as they face frozen roads, shortened daylight, and the very real possibility of dying from exposure in landscapes that become actively hostile to human survival. The bureaucracy of medieval pilgrimage is surprisingly complex. For a supposedly spiritual endeavor, various kingdoms require different documentation, permissions, and fees for passage through their territories. Some rulers view pilgrims as convenient sources of revenue, imposing creative taxes on religious travelers who can't easily avoid payment without abandoning their spiritual quests. Others see pilgrims as potential security threats, requiring detailed questioning about origins, destinations, and purposes that can delay groups for days, while officials decide whether these travelers are legitimate spiritual seekers or disguised spies, merchants avoiding trade regulations, or refugees fleeing justice in their homelands. Disease spreads through pilgrim groups with terrifying efficiency. Close quarters, poor sanitation, and weakened immune systems create perfect conditions for medieval medical disasters. What starts as one person's cough becomes everyone's plague, turning spiritual journeys into mobile epidemic centers that terrorize the communities they pass through. Towns begin posting guards to prevent diseased pilgrims from entering, creating quarantine camps outside city walls, where the sick are left to recover or die, depending on their constitution and divine favor. The irony isn't lost on anyone that people seeking spiritual healing often end up sicker than when they started, though this is generally attributed to God testing their faith, rather than basic hygiene failure. Local customs and traditions along the route provide endless opportunities for cultural misunderstandings that range from embarrassing to dangerous. What's considered polite behavior in one region becomes mortal insult in another, leading to confrontations between well-meaning pilgrims and offended locals who don't appreciate foreign visitors, ignoring sacred traditions they've never heard of. Religious practices vary dramatically between communities, with different saints, different feast days, and different rituals that pilgrims are expected to observe, or risk being branded as heretics, heathens, or worse, tourists who don't respect local culture. The psychological toll of long-distance medieval travel is rarely discussed but constantly present. Weeks of walking through foreign territories, sleeping in unfamiliar places, eating strange food, and constantly facing potential dangers create stress levels that would challenge modern therapists. Pilgrims develop obsessive behaviors, paranoid fantasies, and religious delusions that go far beyond normal medieval spiritual enthusiasm. Some begin seeing signs and omens in everything from cloud formations to the way bread crumbles, while others become convinced they're being personally tested by specific saints who have nothing better to do than make their lives difficult. Crime within pilgrim groups becomes its own specialty category. Theft is common, with desperate travelers stealing from each other while maintaining facades of religious brotherhood. Gambling develops around anything that can be wagered upon, from weather prediction to the survival chances of particularly sickly group members. Fights break out over food distribution, sleeping arrangements, and whose turn it is to carry the group's heaviest equipment. Some pilgrims develop elaborate con games, selling fake relics to their companions, claiming special divine connections that require monetary donations, or offering protection services against threats they've secretly created themselves. The children who somehow end up on these journeys face challenges that would traumatize modern social workers. Some are orphans seeking better lives. Others are accompanying adult relatives who couldn't leave them behind. And a few are runaways who joined pilgrim groups, thinking adventure would be more appealing than whatever they were fleeing. These young travelers often become group mascots, carried when they're too tired to walk, fed first when food is scarce, and protected fiercely by adults who recognize their vulnerability. However, they also witness violence, disease, and death at ages when modern children are worried about homework and video games. Navigation disputes become legendary sources of group conflict. Everyone claims to know the correct route, despite evidence suggesting that none of them have ever been to Santiago before. Arguments over directions can split groups permanently, with factions marching off in different directions, while shouting religious justifications for their chosen paths. Some pilgrims become so convinced of their navigational abilities that they lead breakaway groups into wilderness areas, mountain ranges, or hostile territories where the only signs of previous travelers are bleached bones and abandoned equipment. The wildlife along pilgrim routes views these traveling humans as either entertainment or opportunity. Wolves follow groups at respectful distances, waiting for stragglers who fall behind, or pilgrims who wander off to relieve themselves in privacy. Bears treat pilgrim camps like medieval drive-through restaurants, helping themselves to food supplies, while travelers huddle in terror and pray loudly enough to wake neighboring villages. Smaller animals are equally problematic, with rats stealing provisions, insects providing constant misery, and birds that seem to coordinate their bathroom schedules with meal times. The relationship between pilgrims and nature becomes a constant negotiation between spiritual seeking and basic survival instincts. Money becomes a complex issue when you're trying to maintain spiritual poverty while needing actual currency to avoid starving to death. Some pilgrims attempt to survive entirely through charity and divine providence, which works until they encounter communities that have already been picked clean by previous groups of spiritually needy travelers. Others hide money in creative places, leading to awkward situations when they're searched by suspicious authorities or need to make purchases while maintaining their persona of holy poverty. The economics of pilgrimage create moral dilemmas that would challenge medieval theologians, if any theologians were foolish enough to attempt these journeys themselves. Sleep deprivation becomes a constant companion when your accommodations range from monastery dormitories filled with snoring strangers to outdoor camps where every sound could indicate approaching danger. Pilgrims develop the ability to sleep while walking, a skill that's impressive until someone marches directly into a tree, off a cliff, or into the territory of unfriendly locals who don't appreciate being invaded by unconscious religious travelers. Dreams become vivid and often indistinguishable from hallucinations, brought on by poor nutrition, physical exhaustion, and the psychological stress of constant uncertainty. The return journey presents challenges that many pilgrims don't anticipate during their initial burst of religious enthusiasm. After achieving their spiritual goal at Santiago, they still need to walk all the way back home, assuming they remember where home is, and it still exists when they return. Some pilgrims discover that family members have given them up for dead, redistributed their property, and are none too pleased to see them returning, with claims to possessions that have already been inherited by others. The spiritual enlightenment gained from pilgrimage often clashes with the practical realities of resuming normal life after months of adventure, danger, and constant religious focus. Fake pilgrims become a serious problem as the routes become more established and profitable. Criminals pose as religious travelers to gain access to charity, free lodging, and the trust of genuine pilgrims who make easy targets for theft and fraud. Distinguishing between authentic spiritual seekers and clever opportunists becomes an art form that experienced travelers develop through painful trial and error. Some fake pilgrims become so committed to their covers that they accidentally achieve genuine religious experiences, leading to identity crises that complicate their original criminal intention. The paperwork involved in medieval travel is surprisingly extensive for a time period, often characterized as bureaucratically primitive. Letters of introduction, safe passage documents, religious credentials, and proof of legitimate pilgrimage purposes are required by various authorities along the routes. Forged documents become valuable commodities, with specialists who can produce convincing papal seals, noble signatures, and monastery stamps that fool most officials who can't read anyway, but are impressed by official-looking wax blobs and fancy handwriting. Border crossings become exercises in creative diplomacy when you're traveling through regions where yesterday's ally is today's mortal enemy and tomorrow's trading partner. Political situations change faster than pilgrim groups can adjust their routes, leading to situations where travelers with safe passage documents from one ruler find themselves imprisoned by another ruler, who's recently declared war on anyone associated with the first ruler. Bribes become necessary expenses, with experienced pilgrims budgeting specifically for official corruption and unofficial administrative fees that spontaneously appear whenever authorities encounter foreign travelers with questionable documentation. The development of pilgrim-specific infrastructure creates boom towns that exist solely to separate religious travelers from their money. These settlements spring up overnight around holy sites, river crossings, or mountain passes, where pilgrims have no choice but to stop. Everything is overpriced, from basic food to equipment repairs to spiritual services that may or may not be authentic. Some enterprising locals create fake holy sites, complete with manufactured relics, and paid actors who testify to miraculous healings, because separating pilgrims from their money is apparently considered a legitimate business model, rather than fraud. Weather prediction becomes a survival skill when your life depends on not being caught in storms. While crossing exposed terrain, pilgrims develop folk wisdom about cloud formations, wind patterns, and animal behavior that's sometimes accurate and often deadly wrong. Trusting local weather advice proves problematic when locals have different definitions of mild shower and brief cold snap that don't account for travelers sleeping outdoors with inadequate protection. Some pilgrim groups appoint weather watchers whose sole responsibility is scanning skies for signs of impending doom, though their track record for accuracy rarely improves beyond random chance. The politics of group leadership create miniature medieval kingdoms within pilgrim bands. Power struggles develop over route decisions, resource allocation, and the pace of travel that accommodate everyone from young adventurers to elderly pilgrims who joined this journey as their final earthly act. Democratic processes work until life or death decisions need making quickly, at which point whoever has the loudest voice or sharpest sword tends to become the temporary dictator. These leadership transitions often happen multiple times per day, depending on circumstances and the relative exhaustion levels of potential authority figures. Equipment failure becomes a constant source of anxiety when replacement parts are unavailable, and repair skills are limited to whatever knowledge group members happen to possess. Shoes disintegrate first, followed by clothing, bags, and anything made of leather that wasn't properly treated for extended outdoor use. Improvised repairs using local materials create hybrid equipment that barely functions, but keeps pilgrims mobile enough to continue their journeys. Some travelers become walking museums of creative engineering, with boots held together by tree bark, cloaks patched with grass, and bags reinforced with stones and hope. Religious enthusiasm varies dramatically among group members, from genuine spiritual seekers to people who joined pilgrimages for entirely secular reasons, and now find themselves trapped in extended religious experiences they never wanted. These reluctant pilgrims often become the most vocal complainers, the first to suggest shortcuts that bypass holy sites, and the most creative in finding excuses to abandon the journey early. Their presence creates theological debates about the spiritual validity of pilgrimage completed under duress, protest, or active resentment toward the entire concept of walking across Europe for religious purposes. Hygiene becomes a relative concept when your washing facilities consist of whatever water sources you encounter along the way. Rivers and streams serve multiple purposes, from drinking water to laundry facilities, to bathing areas, to sewage disposal, often simultaneously and by the same communities. Personal cleanliness standards adjust rapidly to accommodate reality, with clean being redefined as not actively crawling with visible insects, and fresh, meaning hasn't been worn for more than a week consecutively. Soap is a luxury item that few pilgrims carry, making personal grooming and exercising creative problem-solving using available natural resources. The folklore and legends that develop around pilgrim routes create their own mythology that rivals official religious doctrine. Stories of miraculous rescues, divine interventions, and supernatural encounters spread faster than accurate information about road conditions or weather patterns. These tales serve multiple purposes: entertainment during long walking days, moral instruction for new pilgrims, and advertising for local communities, hoping to attract pilgrim traffic to their manufactured holy sites. Distinguishing between genuine miraculous events and elaborate marketing schemes becomes increasingly difficult when everyone has financial incentives to embellish their stories. Cultural exchange happens, whether participants want it or not, when people from different regions are forced together for extended periods under stressful conditions. Languages blend into pidgin communications, cooking techniques combine in strange ways, and religious practices merge in formations that would horrify church authorities if they were paying attention. These cultural fusions often survive long after pilgrimages end, with returning travelers introducing foreign customs to their home communities and creating inadvertent international connections that bypass official diplomatic channels. The seasonal migration patterns of pilgrim groups create their own ecosystem that affects everything from local economies to wildlife behavior along the established routes. Communities plan their entire annual cycles around expected pilgrim traffic, with harvest festivals timed to coincide with peak travel seasons, and winter preparations that account for reduced income during months when religious tourism drops to levels that only the most dedicated or desperate travelers attempt. Animals learn to associate certain times of year with increased food opportunities and human activity, leading to behavioral changes that persist even during off-season periods. Technological innovation driven by pilgrim needs leads to developments in portable equipment, preservation techniques, and navigation aids that benefit far beyond religious travel. Improved shoe designs, better food storage methods, and more efficient pack configurations are developed by people whose lives depend on equipment reliability. These innovations spread throughout medieval society as returning pilgrims share their hard-won knowledge with communities that benefit from improved technology, even if they never leave their home villages. The international aspect of pilgrimage creates unofficial diplomatic networks that sometimes prove more effective than formal political channels. Pilgrims carry news, messages, and cultural information across borders that official messengers can't or won't cross due to political tensions. These informal communication networks become crucial during periods of conflict when normal diplomatic relations break down. But information still needs to flow between regions. Some pilgrims unknowingly serve as spies, merchants, or political agents while believing they're solely engaged in spiritual activities. Mental health challenges multiply when you're dealing with constant physical discomfort, social stress, and spiritual pressure while walking through foreign territories where everything from language to food to social customs is unfamiliar and potentially dangerous. Pilgrims develop anxiety disorders about navigation, paranoid obsessions, there's weather patterns, and depression that goes far beyond normal travel fatigue. Some experience religious visions that may be divine communications or symptoms of malnutrition and sleep deprivation, leading to theological debates about whether hallucinations count as legitimate spiritual experiences if they occur during officially sanctioned religious activities. The black market economy that develops around pilgrim routes includes everything from forged documentation to stolen religious artifacts, to services that would scandalize church authorities if they were documented in official records. Contraband smuggling uses pilgrim groups as unwitting cover, with criminals hiding illegal goods among legitimate religious supplies, and travelers who discover they've been transporting banned items across multiple borders while believing they were carrying holy water and blessed bread. These criminal enterprises often provide better organization and more reliable services than legitimate businesses, creating moral dilemmas for pilgrims who need assistance, but can only get it from questionable sources. Educational opportunities arise accidentally when diverse groups of people with different skills and knowledge are forced to cooperate for extended periods. Illiterate peasants learn reading from educated clergy, city dwellers discover rural survival techniques, and everyone exchanges information about their home regions that creates informal geographic and cultural education. These learning experiences often prove more valuable than the official spiritual purposes of pilgrimage, with participants gaining practical knowledge and international perspectives that benefit them throughout their lives, assuming they survive to apply what they've learned. Romantic relationships that develop during pilgrimages face unique challenges when participants come from different social classes, regions, or economic backgrounds that would normally prevent such connections. The equalizing effect of shared hardship temporarily breaks down social barriers, allowing relationships that would be impossible under normal circumstances, but become problematic when participants return to their regular lives, where class differences reassert themselves. These relationships often end tragically when reality conflicts with the temporary social equality of the pilgrim road. The transformation of personality that occurs during extended pilgrimages often surprises participants who expected only spiritual growth, but discover fundamental changes in their character, priorities, and worldview. People who began as timid villagers develop confidence and survival skills that prepare them for leadership roles they never imagined, while others who started as arrogant nobles learn humility through experiences that strip away artificial social protections. These personality changes sometimes conflict with the expectations of family and community members who anticipated welcoming back the same people who left, rather than fundamentally altered individuals. Documentation of pilgrim experiences becomes increasingly important as routes become established and institutionalized, leading to the development of guidebooks, route maps, and advice manuals that attempt to prepare future pilgrims for challenges that can't really be understood without direct experience. These documents often focus on practical concerns, like where to find food and shelter, while downplaying dangers like bandit activity and disease outbreaks that could discourage pilgrim traffic. The gap between written descriptions and actual conditions creates ongoing problems for people who plan their journeys based on optimistic literature rather than realistic assessments. The economic impact of mass pilgrimage creates entire industries dedicated to serving religious travelers, from specialized equipment manufacturers to professional guides who know which routes are safest during different seasons. These pilgrim-focused businesses often develop expertise that surpasses anything available in regular commercial markets because their customers' lives literally depend on product quality and service reliability. Competition between pilgrim service providers leads to innovations in portable technology, food preservation, and medical care that eventually benefit broader society as these improvements spread beyond religious travel applications. Legal complications arise when pilgrims commit crimes, witness crimes, or become victims of crimes in foreign jurisdictions where their home authorities have no power to protect them or seek justice on their behalf. Some criminals deliberately join pilgrim groups to escape prosecution in their home regions, while others discover that religious travel provides excellent cover for illegal activities that would be difficult to accomplish through normal business or social channels. The international nature of pilgrimage route creates jurisdictional nightmares for law enforcement agencies that lack coordination mechanisms for tracking criminals or protecting victims across multiple territories. Seasonal variations in pilgrim group composition create dramatically different travel experiences depending on when journeys begin and what types of people are traveling during specific time periods. Spring departures tend to include more families and older pilgrims who want to avoid harsh weather. Summer groups attract younger adventurers and people with flexible schedules. Autumn travelers often include merchants combining business with pilgrimage, while winter pilgrims are generally either extremely or running from something urgent enough to justify traveling during the most dangerous season. The development of pilgrim-specific medical knowledge creates informal healthcare networks that sometimes provide better treatment than official medical facilities. Experienced pilgrim guides learn to treat common travel injuries and illnesses through practical experience rather than theoretical training, leading to folk medicine practices that are often more effective than university-educated physicians who lack hands-on experience with the specific health challenges of long-distance medieval travel. These informal medical networks become crucial resources for communities along pilgrim routes that benefit from improved healthcare knowledge, even outside religious travel contexts. Religious politics affect pilgrimages in ways that participants rarely anticipate when they begin their spiritual journeys with simple faith and good intentions. Different regions favor different saints, practice different rituals, and maintain different relationships with church hierarchy that can make pilgrims unwitting participants in theological disputes they don't understand. Supporting the wrong saint or practicing the wrong ritual in the wrong location can result in accusations of heresy, political disloyalty, or cultural insensitivity that transforms spiritual journeys into legal and social disasters. The psychology of goal-oriented long-distance travel creates mental frameworks that help pilgrims cope with immediate hardships by focusing on eventual achievement of their spiritual objectives. This psychological structure often works well during the journey, but creates problems when pilgrims actually reach Santiago and discover that achieving their goal doesn't automatically solve the personal problems that motivated their pilgrimage in the first place. The anticlimactic nature of arrival often leads to depression, spiritual crisis, and difficulty adjusting to life after completing what they expected to be a transformative experience. The networking opportunities created by international pilgrimage routes establish connections that influence medieval European politics, trade, and cultural development in ways that extend far beyond religious activities. Pilgrims returning from Santiago carry information about foreign technologies, agricultural techniques, and social innovations that spread throughout Europe through informal networks rather than official diplomatic or commercial channels. These grassroots information exchanges often prove more influential than formal international relations, creating cultural changes that happen gradually through personal connections rather than dramatic political events. The environmental impact of thousands of pilgrims walking the same routes annually creates ecological challenges that medieval communities struggle to manage without modern environmental science or waste management systems. Popular camping areas become degraded from overuse, water sources become contaminated from inadequate sanitation, and local wildlife populations are disrupted by constant human traffic through previously undisturbed habitats. Some communities begin implementing early forms of environmental protection, establishing restricted areas and usage schedules, while others simply relocate when pilgrim traffic makes their traditional territories uninhabitable. The evolution of pilgrim culture creates its own traditions, languages, and social structures that exist independently of both religious orthodoxy and secular authority. Pilgrim groups develop their own informal legal systems for handling disputes, their own economic practices for sharing resources, and their own social hierarchies based on experience and survival skills rather than birth or wealth. These pilgrim subcultures often conflict with established authority structures when they return to normal society, creating tension between people who have experienced alternative social organization and communities that expect them to resume their previous roles without question. Gender dynamics on pilgrim routes challenge medieval social norms in ways that both liberate and endanger female participants. Women traveling in pilgrim groups experience freedoms of movement and social interaction that would be impossible in their home communities, but also face increased risks of violence, sexual assault, and social condemnation from people who believe women shouldn't travel without male family supervision. Some women use pilgrimage as escape from unwanted marriages, abusive situations, or social constraints, while others discover that religious travel simply exposes them to different forms of gender-based discrimination and danger. The commercialization of religious sites along pilgrim routes leads to increasingly elaborate schemes for extracting money from spiritual travelers who feel obligated to make donations, purchase indulgences, and buy religious souvenirs, regardless of their financial situations. Competition between holy sites creates arms races in relic collections, miracle claims, and promotional activities that would impress modern marketing professionals. Some communities invest so heavily in pilgrim-focused religious tourism that they transform from authentic spiritual centers into medieval theme parks designed primarily for profit, rather than genuine religious experience. The homecoming experience often proves more challenging than the pilgrimage itself, when travelers return to communities that have continued living normal lives while they've undergone transformative experiences, physical hardships, and cultural exchanges that are impossible to communicate to people who haven't shared similar adventures. Families expect returning pilgrims to resume their previous roles and responsibilities immediately, without accounting for personality changes, new perspective, or physical limitations developed during months of extreme travel. The gap between pilgrim experiences and home community expectations creates reintegration problems that can last years after the actual journey ends. International incident potential increases dramatically when large groups of foreign pilgrims travel through territories where political tensions already exist between different rulers, regions, or religious factions. Pilgrim groups unwittingly become pawns in larger political conflicts when their presence is interpreted as support for particular sides in disputes they know nothing about. Some rulers deliberately encourage or discourage pilgrim traffic, through their territories as ways of demonstrating alliance or hostility toward the regions that pilgrims represent, turning religious travel into informal, diplomatic communication. The legacy of medieval pilgrimage extends far beyond individual spiritual experiences to influence European development patterns, international relations, and cultural exchange networks that persist long after the golden age of religious travel ends. Modern tourism infrastructure often follows routes originally established by medieval pilgrims. Linguistic borrowings between different European languages frequently trace back to pilgrim-era cultural contact, and many international trade relationships have historical foundations in connections first established through religious travel rather than purely commercial motivations. Finally, after months of walking, bleeding, starving, freezing, sweating, arguing, praying, and questioning every decision that led to this moment, you see it. The towers of Santiago de Compostela, rising from the Spanish landscape like a medieval mirage, proof that you've actually survived this insane journey across plague-ridden Europe with nothing but determination, questionable footwear, and the kind of faith that borders on clinical delusion. Your feet are destroyed, your clothes are held together by hope and creative stitching, your body has been transformed into a walking museum of medieval hardship, but you made it. You actually made it, standing before the cathedral, surrounded by other pilgrims who look exactly as traumatized and triumphant as you feel. The reality hits you. You've just accomplished something that most sensible people would consider impossible, walking 1,000 miles through foreign countries, surviving bandits, disease, starvation, exposure, and the constant threat of death, from causes ranging from infected blisters to political conflicts you never understood. The spiritual transformation you sought may or may not have occurred, but the physical and psychological transformation is undeniable. You're no longer the same person who started this journey, for better or worse. And now, as you kneel before the shrine of St. James, exhausted beyond description, but somehow exhilarated by your survival, you realize the most terrifying truth of all. You have to walk all the way back home. The pilgrimage to Santiago was just half the journey. The return trip awaits through the same bandit-infested territories, the same disease-ridden towns, the same impossible weather conditions, and the same 1,000 miles of European countryside that tried to kill you on the way here. But at least now you know what you're capable of surviving, which is, apparently, almost anything, as long as you're too stubborn to give up, and too faithful to admit that this whole pilgrimage idea was completely insane from the very beginning. Meet Little Wickham. Population 84.7 souls. Assuming you count the village idiot, 3 lepers, and old Margaret, who may or may not be a witch. It's a typical medieval settlement, complete with muddy streets that double as sewers, houses made of sticks and hope, and a social hierarchy based entirely on who owns the most chickens. The village sits in a valley surrounded by forests, which sounds peaceful until you realize those forests are full of wolves, bandits, and mysterious sounds that could be either wild boar or the devil himself having a particularly bad day. The houses lean against each other like drunk peasants after market day, their thatched roofs so close that one fire could burn down half the village in an hour. Life in Little Wickham follows the rhythm of the seasons and the whims of Lord Aldrich the Unpleasant, who rules from his castle on the hill like a medieval mob boss with a crown. The villagers wake before dawn, work until their backs break, eat whatever didn't die of natural causes, and go to bed wondering if tomorrow will bring tax collectors, raiders, or just the usual combination of starvation and despair. It's not exactly paradise, but it's home, and home is about to become a very dangerous place to be. The village church stands at the center of everything, its bell tower visible from every hovel and workshop, calling people to prayer, work, and whatever community disasters require immediate attention. The first sign something's wrong comes with Brother Thomas, a traveling monk who staggers into the village, looking like death warmed over. He's covered in strange black spots that look like someone spilled ink on human skin, speaks in fevered whispers about cities filled with corpses, and keeps muttering prayers in Latin that sound suspiciously like curse words. The village priest, Father Benedict, takes one look at Brother Thomas, crosses himself 17 times, and immediately starts planning his own pilgrimage to somewhere very far away from here. Brother Thomas collapses in the village square, raving about rats the size of cats and bodies stacked like firewood in London streets. Within 3 days, Brother Thomas is dead, but not before spreading his mysterious illness to the baker's wife, the blacksmith's apprentice, and half the children who gathered around him to hear his tales of distant lands. The symptoms are horrifying beyond medieval understanding: fever that could cook an egg, swollen lumps that appear overnight like evil mushrooms, and a cough that sounds like death clearing its throat. The village wise woman, old Agnes, takes one look at the situation, packs her herbs and potion, and disappears into the forest, never to be seen again. Smart woman, though her abandoned cottage becomes a shrine where desperate villagers leave offerings, hoping for magical protection. Panic spreads faster than the disease itself through the narrow streets and cramped houses. Families barricade themselves in their homes, refusing to speak to neighbors they've known their entire lives. The market square becomes a ghost town, except for the occasional desperate soul willing to risk infection for a loaf of bread or a cup of ale, strong enough to wash away the taste of fear. Children stop playing in the streets. Animals sense the wrongness and huddle together, and even the village cats seem to avoid certain houses, as if they can smell death approaching. The normal sounds of village life, hammering from the smithy, grinding from the mill, laughter from the tavern, all fade into an eerie silence broken only by occasional wailing from houses where the plague has taken hold. The death toll climbs with mathematical precision that would fascinate modern epidemiologists if they existed and weren't too busy dying themselves. First the elderly and infirm, then the children and pregnant women, then anyone unlucky enough to breathe the same air as someone who's already infected. Bodies pile up faster than graves can be dug, leading to mass burials in pits that would horrify modern health officials, but represent the best solution available to people who don't understand germs, bacteria, or basic sanitation principles. The village gravedigger, poor Tom, works day and night until he too succumbs, leaving his half-finished graves as monuments to the overwhelming nature of the disaster. Lord Aldrich responds to the crisis, with typical medieval wisdom, by blaming the Jews, the weather, and God's displeasure with the moral failings of peasants. He seals his castle gates, surrounds himself with armed guards, and issues proclamations about the importance of prayer and increased taxes to fund emergency measures that mostly involve building higher walls around his own property. Meanwhile, down in the village, people are dying in numbers that would challenge modern pandemic response teams. His bailiff, Sir Roger the Ruthless, continues collecting taxes from the surviving families even as corpses rot in their doorways, because economic obligations apparently transcend mortal concerns. The village priest faces a theological crisis. When prayer doesn't stop the dying, holy water fails to prevent infection, and even the most devout parishioners succumb to the same horrible symptoms as the village sinners. Father Benedict's faith wavers as he performs last rites for the 15th time in a single day, while trying not to think about the fact that he's probably breathing in death with every prayer. His sermons become increasingly desperate, promising salvation to anyone who donates their remaining possessions to the church before they die. He starts seeing signs and omens in everything from the way candles flicker to how many ravens gather in the churchyard, desperate for any indication that God hasn't completely abandoned Little Wickham. The survivors develop strange behaviors that would fascinate modern psychologists if modern psychologists existed and weren't too busy dying of plague. Some people become obsessively religious, flagellating themselves in public and claiming the end times are upon them. Others turn to wild hedonism, drinking and fornicating as if physical pleasure could somehow ward off death. A few simply go mad, wandering the empty streets, talking to corpses, and laughing at inappropriate moments. The tavern keeper, Big John, maintains his establishment as a gathering place for the desperate, serving watered-down ale to customers who pay with whatever they have left, including family heirlooms and wedding rings. Food production collapses when half the farmers are dead, and the other half are too terrified to work in fields where infected bodies lie rotting. The harvest rots in the ground, animals starve in their pens, and the remaining villagers face the delightful choice between dying of plague or dying of starvation. Some desperate souls resort to looting, stealing from houses where entire families have perished, while others maintain their moral standards and starve with dignity. The mill stops operating when the miller dies, leaving grain to spoil while people go hungry. creating a perfect metaphor for how civilization breaks down when too many key people disappear too quickly. The economic system falls apart when currency becomes meaningless in a world where most potential customers are dead. The village blacksmith, Hugh the Heavy-Handed, tries to maintain normal business operations, despite the fact that his clientele has been reduced from hundreds to dozens. He accepts payment in food, promises of future favors, and occasionally just company from people desperate enough to risk infection for human conversation. The local tavern becomes a gathering place for survivors, who drink away their sorrows and share increasingly wild theories about the plague's origins, ranging from poisoned wells to angry dragons, to God's wrath against people who work on Sundays. Children who survive the initial outbreak face challenges that would traumatize modern child psychologists. Many are orphaned, forced to fend for themselves, in a world that's already hostile to young people under normal circumstances. Some are taken in by relatives, others form makeshift families with other survivor children, and a few simply disappear into the forests surrounding the village where they either die alone or somehow adapt to feral existence. The village school, such as it was, closes permanently when the priest who taught reading died, leaving an entire generation without access to education, beyond whatever practical survival skills they can pick up from adults too busy staying alive to provide proper instruction. The village's social structure crumbles when traditional authority figures either die or flee, leaving power vacuums that are filled by whoever has the courage or desperation to take charge. The miller's son, young William, finds himself making decisions about resource allocation and burial procedures despite being only 16 years old and having no experience with anything more complex than operating a grain mill. Leadership becomes less about birthright and more about survival instincts, creating a rough democracy of desperation where decisions are made by whoever shows up to the impromptu meetings held in the tavern's main room. Medical knowledge proves utterly inadequate for dealing with a disease that kills with such efficiency and apparent randomness. The village-wise woman's replacement, a desperate widow named Martha, tries every folk remedy she can remember, from burning herbs to ward off evil spirits to bleeding patients to balance their humors. Nothing works, leading to increasingly desperate measures, including prayers to saints who may or may not exist, and folk magic that definitely doesn't work. Martha eventually develops her own theory that the plague is caused by corrupted air, leading her to prescribe holding flowers over the nose and mouth, which actually helps a little by reducing direct contact with infected droplets. The few surviving animals present their own challenges when there aren't enough people left to properly care for livestock that represent the difference between minimal sustenance and complete starvation. Cows go unmilked, pigs escape their pens, and chickens run wild through the empty village, creating an apocalyptic farm scenario that would be comedic if it weren't so tragic. Some animals adapt to feral life, others simply die from neglect, and a few seem to thrive in the absence of human supervision. The village dogs become particularly problematic, forming packs that scavenge among the abandoned houses and occasionally threaten the few remaining humans. Communication with the outside world becomes increasingly difficult when travelers avoid plague-stricken areas, and survivors are too fearful to leave their village for news from neighboring settlements. Rumors spread about entire cities being abandoned to the dead, kingdoms falling apart, and the end of civilization as they know it. Some stories are true, others are exaggerated, and a few are completely fabricated by people whose minds have been broken by trauma. The isolation becomes psychologically devastating when people realize they may be among the last human beings left alive in a world consumed by disease and death. Winter arrives early, adding cold and hunger to the existing misery of disease and death. The few survivors huddle together in the largest remaining house, sharing body heat, meager food supplies, and increasingly fantastic stories about life before the plague. They develop superstitions about which actions might prevent infection, which prayers might work, and which behaviors might anger whatever forces are responsible for their suffering. The winter is particularly harsh, with snowfall that blocks roads and prevents any possibility of outside help, assuming outside help still exists anywhere in plague-ravaged Europe. Spring brings a glimmer of hope when new growth appears in abandoned gardens, and some of the surviving animals begin reproducing again. The handful of villagers who've managed to survive the worst pandemic in European history face the daunting task of rebuilding their community from almost nothing. They have experience, trauma, and a deep appreciation for being alive, but very little else in terms of resources or infrastructure. The population has dropped from 84,000 to fewer than 200, and many of those bear physical or psychological scars that will affect them for the rest of their lives. The final count is devastating but not uncommon for the period. Little Wickham joins thousands of other European communities that have been hollowed out by plague, transformed from thriving settlements into collections of empty houses and overgrown fields. The village that emerges from the plague years is fundamentally different from the one that existed before, with new social structures, different economic relationships, and a collective trauma that will be passed down through generations of survivors. Property ownership becomes fluid when most of the original owners are dead, creating opportunities for social mobility that would have been impossible under normal circumstances, and yet, somehow, life continues. The survivors plant new crops, rebuild damaged houses, and slowly begin the long process of creating a new version of normal. They marry, have children, and tell stories about the terrible time when death walked among them, and most of their neighbours simply disappeared. Little Wickham endures, changed but not defeated, proving that human resilience can survive almost anything, including medieval medicine, and the complete collapse of everything they thought they could depend on. The village becomes a symbol of survival against impossible odds, though whether that survival represents victory or simply stubborn refusal to accept defeat remains an open question. Meet Sir Geoffrey de Blackstone, defender of Ravenshollow Castle, and current holder of the least enviable job in medieval England. His castle sits on a strategic hill, controlling the only decent road between two kingdoms that really don't like each other. It's a typical Norman stronghold with walls thick enough to stop catapult stones, towers high enough to see approaching armies, and dungeons deep enough to store all the unpleasant things that happen during wartime. The castle houses about 300 people, including knights, men-at-arms, servants, and a surprisingly large number of people whose jobs involve cleaning up after everyone else. The fortress was designed to withstand short sieges, not the extended conflicts that medieval warfare seems to specialize in. The siege begins on a Tuesday morning when Sir Geoffrey's lookouts spot an army of roughly 2,000 soldiers marching up the valley with siege engines, supply wagons, and the kind of grim determination that suggests they're planning to stay for a while. The attacking force belongs to Duke Richard the Vindictive, who's decided that Sir Geoffrey's castle represents an unacceptable obstacle to his territorial ambitions, and possibly his ego. The Duke has brought catapults, battering ram, and enough provisions to outlast most reasonable defenders. His army spreads across the valley like a medieval plague, setting up camps that look disturbingly permanent and organized. Sir Geoffrey calls his war council, a gathering of military professionals who've seen enough combat to know the difference between heroic last stands and tactical stupidity. They inventory their supplies, count their weapons, and perform the grim mathematics of siege warfare, which mostly involves calculating how long they can survive on increasingly creative food combinations. The castle stores contain enough grain for 3 months, salted meat for 6 weeks, and ale for about 10 days, assuming normal consumption rates, which are about to become completely irrelevant. The well provides adequate water for normal circumstances, but 300 people confined to castle grounds present abnormal circumstances, by any reasonable standard. The first week passes with relatively civilized warfare involving polite exchanges of arrows, occasional catapult stones, and formal demands for surrender delivered by heralds who risk their lives to maintain medieval diplomatic protocol. Duke Richard offers reasonable terms, Sir Geoffrey politely declines, and both sides settle in for what everyone knows will be a long, uncomfortable, and probably fatal test of endurance. The real siege begins when the food starts running low, and creative problem-solving becomes a matter of survival rather than military strategy. The initial optimism about quick relief or negotiated settlement fades, as both sides realize this conflict will be decided by attrition rather than heroic action. Life inside the castle transforms from military routine to desperate improvisation faster than anyone anticipated. The Great Hall becomes a dormitory for anyone without private quarters, which means most people sleep on straw mattresses, surrounded by strangers who may or may not have bathed recently. Privacy disappears entirely, personal space becomes a luxury, and everyone learns far more about their neighbors' habits than they ever wanted to know. The constant proximity breeds both camaraderie and homicidal fantasies, sometimes simultaneously. Tempers flare over trivial matters, food distribution, sleeping arrangement, and whose turn it is to empty the chamber pots. Food rationing begins almost immediately with increasingly creative definitions of what constitutes edible protein. The castle's chickens disappear first, followed by the pigs, then the horses, and eventually anything that moves and can't effectively fight back. The cook, Master Edmund, develops an impressive repertoire of rat-based recipes and discovers that pigeons taste better than they have any right to when you're desperate enough. Meals become social events not because the food is good, but because eating together helps maintain the illusion of civilized behavior. Breakfast might consist of thin gruel made from grain sweepings, lunch could be mystery meat stew, and dinner often involves whatever small animals the castle cats manage to catch. Water becomes a strategic resource when the castle's well proves inadequate for 300 people who can't venture outside to find alternative sources. Bathing becomes a luxury, then a memory, then a distant dream from a time when people cared about personal hygiene. The castle develops its own ecosystem of smells that would challenge modern waste management experts. Everyone adapts, or goes insane, or both, depending on their tolerance for medieval living conditions. The well water starts tasting strange after a few weeks, leading to suspicions that enemy forces might be poisoning the supply, though the reality is probably just overconsumption and poor filtration. The psychological warfare begins when Duke Richard's forces start using catapults to launch more than just stones, dead animals, severed heads, and messages describing the various tortures awaiting captured defenders sail over the castle walls with disturbing regularity. The attacking army also employs musicians who play mournful tunes about death and defeat at all hours of the day and night, creating a soundtrack for the siege that would impress modern psychological operations specialists. Sleep becomes difficult when every night brings new horrors launched over the walls, from rotting corpses to bags of human waste, designed to spread disease and lower morale. Sir Geoffrey maintains morale through a combination of inspirational speeches, public executions of defeatists, and creative storytelling about the reinforcements that are definitely coming to relieve the siege any day now. He institutes daily training exercises, organizes entertainment, and maintains strict discipline while privately calculating how long his authority will last when people start dying of starvation rather than enemy action. Leadership during a siege requires balancing honesty with hope, and sometimes choosing neither option. The knights under his command begin showing signs of strain as their horses are slaughtered for food and their equipment deteriorates without replacement. The castle's defences prove remarkably effective against direct assault, but completely useless against hunger, disease, and the gradual breakdown of social order. The walls that keep enemies out also keep defenders in, creating a prison where the guards are also the prisoners. Siege engines pound the fortifications with monotonous regularity, but the real damage comes from within, as people slowly realize that their situation is essentially hopeless. Attempts to break out and fight through enemy lines result in massacre, while staying inside means slow death by starvation, creating an impossible choice between quick death and prolonged suffering. Disease spreads through the overcrowded castle with predictable efficiency. Close quarters, poor sanitation, and weakened immune systems create perfect conditions for medieval medical disasters. The castle's physician, Brother Marcus, does his best with limited supplies and medical knowledge. That's approximately 500 years behind modern standards. Treatments involve prayer, bloodletting, and herbal remedies that sometimes work through pure luck rather than scientific understanding. When people start dying from disease rather than enemy action, the psychological impact proves almost worse than the physical losses, creating panic that spreads faster than the infections themselves. The siege engines outside create a constant percussion section for daily life inside the castle. Catapult stones crash into walls, battering rams pound against gates, and arrows whistle overhead with enough frequency to become background noise. People develop the ability to sleep through bombardments, eat during attacks, and maintain conversations while stones bounce off nearby walls. Adaptation to extreme circumstances becomes a survival skill rather than a lifestyle choice. Children prove remarkably resilient, turning the sounds of warfare into games. While adults struggle with the psychological impact of constant threat, children trapped inside the castle face unique challenges in an environment designed for warfare rather than child rearing. They adapt with typical resilience, turning siege warfare into elaborate games and finding entertainment in circumstances that traumatize adults. Some children thrive, others withdraw, and a few develop the kind of survival instincts that will serve them well in a world where violence is always a possibility and safety is never guaranteed. The castle's few women, mostly servants and family members of the garrison, find themselves caring for orphaned children whose parents have succumbed to disease or enemy action. The economic system inside the castle evolves from standard feudal relationships to a barter economy based on scarcity and desperation. Food becomes currency, information becomes valuable, and services that maintain comfort command premium prices. The castle's social hierarchy partially collapses when survival becomes more important than birth or title. Though Sir Geoffrey maintains just enough authority to prevent complete anarchy, gambling becomes popular as people bet on everything from the weather to which section of wall will be hit next by catapult stones, creating a strange form of entertainment that helps distract from the increasingly desperate circumstances. Communication with the outside world becomes a high-stakes game involving carrier pigeons, coded messages, and volunteers willing to risk death by sneaking through enemy lines. News from beyond the siege provides psychological sustenance almost as important as actual food. Reports of approaching relief forces, political developments, and events in the wider world help maintain hope even when the news is mostly fabricated to improve morale. The few successful messengers who make it back to the castle bring information that's often weeks old and may no longer be relevant, but any connection to the outside world feels like a lifeline. Winter arrives to make an already desperate situation completely unbearable. The castle's heating system consists of fireplaces that require wood that can't be replenished from outside sources. People huddle together for warmth, burn furniture for fuel, and gradually strip anything combustible from their living environment. Cold becomes another enemy alongside hunger, disease, and the army outside the walls. The castle's stores of winter clothing prove inadequate for people who spend most of their time indoors in unheated spaces, leading to frostbite and other cold-related injuries that compound existing health problems. The final assault comes not as a dramatic storming of the battlements, but as a negotiated surrender, when Sir Geoffrey realizes that his people are dying faster from starvation and disease than they would from enemy weapons. The terms are surprisingly reasonable. Duke Richard wants the castle not a massacre, and most defenders are allowed to leave with their lives, if not their possessions. The siege ends not with heroic last stands but with paperwork and practical arrangements for transferring property. The surrender ceremony involves formal rituals that maintain honor for both sides while acknowledging the practical reality that resistance has become pointless. The aftermath reveals the true cost of medieval siege warfare. Of the 300 people who began the siege inside Ravenshollow Castle, fewer than 200 survive, and most of those require weeks of recovery before they can resume normal activities. The castle itself is damaged, but repairable. The real destruction lies in the human cost of a conflict that achieved relatively minor political objectives through maximum suffering. Sir Geoffrey retires to a small manor far from strategic locations where he spends his remaining years writing memoirs that nobody reads about, the siege that nobody wants to remember. But life continues as it always does. Duke Richard installs a new garrison, repairs the damage, and presumably learns nothing about the human cost of territorial ambitions. The castle returns to its strategic function, the roads remain controlled, and somewhere another ambitious noble is probably planning the next siege that will test the limits of human endurance in pursuit of goals that future historians will struggle to explain to anyone who values human life over political abstractions. The cycle of medieval warfare continues, powered by noble ambition and peasant suffering, creating stories of heroism and horror that will be told for generations by people who hopefully will never have to live through such experiences themselves.